Okay, everybody. So good evening. Welcome to another live stream. And as you join, I want to just take a moment to talk about, we're going to talk about hang on. Right. Okay. So there's a massive echo. Hang on. Can you still hear me, Rebecca? Okay.
Yes, I can. Yeah.
Okay, so that seemed to have removed the echo. So, good evening. Rebecca's with me here, Rebecca Butler, back again by popular demand. And we're going to talk about the origins of lockdown, or maybe not quite what we thought. We're going to talk about essentially how we got into where we are, let alone how the heck we get out of it. And there's a lot of material to go through there. So first of all, a very warm welcome, Rebecca.
Thank you, David. Nice to see you again.
So what I'm going to have to do, Rebecca, is you're going to have to give me just one moment to get my headphones back in here, because for some reason they give a massive echo. Right.
Well, I'll just say hello to all of the people who come on. Stephen, Jed. Oh, hello, Jed again. Daniel, Chris, all of them. Hello, everybody. Really nice to see you on the stream.
Great. Yeah, I'm back again. That's just
great.
temporary deafness. So listen, Rebecca, let me start off with how I understood things, and then we can elaborate. And by the way, huge numbers. That's great. So my understanding was that in March, essentially, thanks to pressure from SAGE and probably most notably Professor Ferguson, Boris was swayed from herd immunity into lockdown, and thus that's how we got to where we started anyway. Is that correct?
I think it's a little bit more nuanced than that, and I get my information really from two sources. I've looked at the SAGE minutes, which the government has now published. And that is as a response to the Simon Dolan litigation, which I'm sure many of your viewers will know. But for those who don't, Simon Dolan is a very wealthy aviation entrepreneur, and he is litigating the government against the lockdown. He's doing it through judicial review and is extremely well represented in the High Court. Now, part of his case and the early motions in the case are all about getting disclosure, and the government is very slow to disclose what he actually wants. But as I say, he's extremely well advised, extremely well funded, and as a result of his application, actually, the SAGE minutes were published. The SAGE minutes are backed up by scientific papers, which are referenced, and I'll come on to that. But what is really interesting is what happens in the run-up to the March 23rd big decision on lockdown. And everything is referable back from the end of February, beginning of March, to Boris Johnson making reference to the pandemic plan. And the pandemic plan was basically an influenza pandemic plan, but it did consider in the sort of the annexes to the document, the incidence of a coronavirus. Now, there is a difference between influenza and coronavirus, but the government was quite clear that their modeling and their policies were all on this 2011 document. And for those of your readers who, your viewers who are interested, I will post a link on Twitter to it later. So that was the policy. And if you read that pandemic plan, at no point does it mention the word lockdown anywhere. This is something unknown. Really in our history, apart from if you live in China. So the most that the influenza pandemic plan would go to was school lockdown. But of course, you'll know, and your viewers will know, that influenza is highly contagious amongst children, and they are super spreaders. So, and I think I've said this to you last time, I refer to children as germ warfare. They are biological weapons when it comes to influenza. And they are a major vector. So shutting the schools was the most extreme measure that was foreseeable in an influenza pandemic. Business as normal, though. Business continuity was something that is referred to many, many times. Keep the businesses going, they keep the economy going, but shield, quarantine, and potentially only at the highest alert, shut the schools. And you're looking at 300 admissions to intensive care every single day for it to be high, designated high. So that was the plan that the government was working on. The distinction is, though, that COVID-19, SARS-2 does have an incubation period of a median of 14 days with a maximum of 23. There are a huge number of silent spreaders. Children are not a vector. And influenza, as you know, is 3 to 5 days. So there is a big difference in the modeling, but I think the fact is that in that pandemic plan, they talk about herd immunity, they talk about vaccination, and they talk about the flattening of the curve, all the things that we've now become familiar with. But the key point to note is lockdown is not a policy. So you go through March, and I'm only referring to the minutes here of the SAGE meetings. Lockdown's not mentioned. And the last time that SAGE met was, in fact, the 17th or 18th of March. So after the social distancing measures were put in, they met, they had a discussion at that meeting about the sort of moral and ethical aspects of quarantine. They said that the social distancing measures would take 2 weeks to assess their effectiveness. They discussed the fact that London was seeing a higher rate of disease transmission, but it was the view of SAGE that on polling that London was being more compliant than the rest of the country on the social distancing measures. Now, you will recall what the press was doing at this time, because the press was putting out these pictures of people who clearly were social distancing, saying they're not social distancing. And those pictures of the Peak District of, on a long leg, you can make 1,000 people who are separated by 3,000 feet. You can make them look all bunched together. So it's entirely possible that they were socially distanced, but the media wanted this headline of lockdown. So, well, that's my theory. But looking at the SAGE, at no point at the last meeting of SAGE was any evidence put forward or any commentary put forward that suggested that there should be a further tightening of the restrictions in place. We then go into the weekend, the media panic, and then on the Tuesday, Boris gave what Paul Chaplin called his resignation speech, which I thought the way he said it was really quite funny. Boris said, right, we're in lockdown, but SAGE hadn't met. That was not done with the scientists or the science. That was done after a COBRA meeting.
So that's the key moment, isn't it, really? That decision by Boris on the Tuesday, it wasn't a SAGE-informed decision. It was a COBRA-informed decision. Is that correct? That's
absolutely right. And of course, COBRA, it's politicians, it's civil servants, I don't know who was at the COBRA meetings, and we will never get the COBRA minutes. It'd be great if Dolan gets them, but we'll never get those minutes because they are by their very nature secret. But it's actually dishonest to say that this has been done on the science, because SAGE would have been giving an indication on that 18th and 19th meeting that lockdown was the more appropriate and that the numbers were getting out of control. Because don't forget, over that weekend, critically, that was the weekend where all of the capacity was then basically finalized, because the elective surgery was put off.
Yeah.
Or consultant appointments put off, cancer screening, chemotherapy, radiotherapy, all of the normal hospital activity that is not emergency was adjourned in the week before that. At that weekend of the 20th of March, Sir Simon Stevens wrote that letter that said, get rid of your 21-day plus patients, get rid of them. So that was 15,000 further beds completed that weekend. And by then, the hospitals had divided themselves into traffic light systems. You had separate entrances. All of the planning was in place that weekend. And then bizarrely, on the Tuesday, Boris hit the nuclear button.
I mean, I hope everybody's paying attention to this, because it's fundamentally sort of restructuring how this thing started. Because, so can I ask, Rebecca, the letter that went out from Sir Simon, what was the basis behind that? Was that from the plan that was in place? Where did that come from? The imperative to get 15,000 people basically chucked out into the care homes and elsewhere?
Yeah, so this is, again, I know we discussed this last time, but this is the big scandal, because by March the 20th, which was that weekend that those 15,000 were discharged, we knew that the risk group was the over 75s, say, with the highest risk of death.
Yeah.
And at that stage, somebody, and this could have been at Cobra, would have said, actually, Italy should not be our model, because, and I'm sorry if this sounds slightly offensive, but I am an ex-nurse and we tend to talk in these terms. Italy was ventilating corpses through the month of February. So, and people were being freaked out by images of predominantly elderly people on ventilators. And of course, anybody in medicine knows that ventilation in itself creates medical problems. So you have to be so fit to survive a ventilator. And our doctors, best in the world, our doctors were saying, no, we're not ventilating 80-year-olds because we're just going to cause so many problems with tracheotomies, secondary infections, sepsis, all those multi-organ failures. So ironically, and this was where they weren't thinking things through properly, the very group that they were going to have to treat, they chucked them out of hospital. The very group they were going to be asked to readmit. So, and then as we know, they didn't readmit them. Doctors were not going out to the care homes. And I say this so many times, the media has completely missed the trick on this. They're not holding the government to account for throwing people who, okay, they were 21-day plus, but they were the healthier ones. That they were just stepped down. The really sick ones stayed in and died, but they were probably going to die anyway within a month. But the ones, those 15,000, I think that not that they were avoidable deaths, but the way they died and having to go through the drama of the discharge and then to go into care homes where the staff carers, they're not nurses. They, as I said before, They don't have syringe drivers. They don't have morphine. They don't have those sort of things available to them.
Yeah. Yeah.
Why
Yeah.
did we do that? Why did we decide to create capacity for the very people who were going to need the capacity? It just defies logic why they did that.
And then, Rebecca, so if you put all that in context then, and we talk about the media then. So the media were very keen to have the lockdown brought about. They just needed the UK lockdown. And that was where there was the immense pressure on the Prime Minister. So you had that on the one hand. And then on the other hand, and that was obviously then devoid of sage imperative behind it. It was just essentially got to get a lockdown, got to keep the media happy. At the same time, the hospitals were being prepared for the tsunami that never came by discharging the 15,000. And so there's like two parallel scandals basically within the space of 5 or 6 days in March. And yet the media didn't talk about the care homes until only this last number of weeks, really. And they've never had any kind of interest in understanding, and perhaps from what you say, I can understand why, the motivations for Boris to lock us down. He was feeding them what they wanted, and which they still want as well. I mean, actually, I want to see if I can show you. I want to show you something if I can, Rebecca. Just let me see if I can bring something up on screen here. See if it comes up. You can see that this is from today's Telegraph. So right up to date. This is the Telegraph too, no less. Professor Lockdown, Neil Ferguson. And the only reason I'm showing you that is here we are, and it's June, and it's Professor Lockdown, Neil Ferguson. And so it's like the media seem to be, they've got their man, haven't they? The guy who they're going to hang it on is Neil Ferguson.
Yeah, well, see, that raises a really interesting point because, forgive me for not knowing which number it is, but it's about the 17th of March. There's a SAGE meeting. And in that SAGE meeting, they say very explicitly in the minutes, the evidence shows that there is a grave risk of quarantining people in a domestic environment because we know if we force people into close communion with their family group or with the people they live with, the rate of transmission is inevitable in that family group. And they actually commissioned, it was the 17th of March, they actually commissioned a study from the Department of Health and Social Care on their ethics committee to look into the ethics of lockdown, loss of liberty effectively, and quarantine, bearing in mind that they knew that by quarantining people and forcing them into communion, closer communion than normal with their family, they knew that would raise the risk of transmission within family groups. And that is where we have seen, a significant number of disease is one person gets it, the whole family gets it.
Yeah. But despite that's what happened.
It's exactly what happened. And SAGE was effectively saying to the government, quarantine isn't a good idea. What they were talking in that meeting in SAGE, they were saying cocoon people. So protect the vulnerable. As Boris had announced on the 17th, after that SAGE meeting, he said 12 weeks effective quarantine for the most vulnerable in society. And that came out of that SAGE meeting where they knew that restricting liberty amongst families would cause an increase in the infection rate within the family. So, I could just go on for hours about all of the evidence that has come out in this Dolan litigation, which shows that, I sound like a raving lunatic, David. It shows that this government is a bunch of sixth formers running the show. And they're saying, well, it's the scientists. They let Professor Ferguson take the stick, knowing full well that they ignored SAGE advice. I'm staggered that I'm saying this. I really am staggered.
Yeah, but it's so important, Rebecca, that we get this information out, because you're not going to see this story on the BBC or Sky or ITV. They've got a totally different narrative. But those decisions and the things that happened then affect all of us. We're all in various degrees been massively impacted by decisions. And I have to say, I mean, if I've heard a government minister say it once, I've heard it 100 times. We follow the science. We follow the science. And it made me think it's like the science is a shield, but actually it's not quite that at all, is it? Because it wasn't there as a shield. It's even more peculiar than I thought.
Yeah, well, see, because science isn't binary. So science actually, it's an evolution of thought, and a good scientist and scientific method is about building on what you know, dismissing that which you can't repeat in an experiment or in a data set, and it's a sort of agile, organic process that grows. It doesn't just get plucked out of the air. So this is why last week on this show, I was very slow to criticize Prof. Ferguson, because I'm not qualified to criticize the guy. And he's one of X number of essentially civil servants. But my criticism at the time is, why are you listening to that view and not the Oxford view? But now I know they didn't listen to any of them, but they blamed them.
Yeah, I think that's the thing that's most disturbing. It's the fact that the scientific community, and I agree, by the way, with what you say entirely, Rebecca. Science is not a fixed thing. It's one of the reasons I've got such a problem with the global warming brigade, and the consensus in science. There's no such thing, because it always moves on. But the scientists, nonetheless, have been overtly used by the politicians, the government, to justify things which the scientists weren't really in favor of. So I hope everybody is paying. You need to be waking up to this, folks, because it's such an eye-opening moment for me. And I guess, like many, Rebecca, I mean, I read what the government says, I follow what they say, and inevitably you're caught up in their narrative. And for me, the narrative is bad Professor Ferguson, good government, we're doing our best. But the other thing is, I mean, Boris, on one of his, when he re-emerged from recovery from COVID, when he did his first TV broadcast, he specifically mentioned Professor Ferguson's 500,000 deaths figure. So, and that wasn't so many weeks ago as well. So it's actually quite shameless, really, isn't it? I mean, I don't like to say this in some regards, but it's shameless the way this government's behaved then.
Yeah, I mean, and this is an interesting point that Paul Chaplin raised this afternoon when I spoke to him, because the 500,000 figure, it went from 250 down to 90 up to 500,000. So it was a movable figure. Now, what Paul says is this is because the behavioral science was basing its decision-making and its advice on focus groups, NHS focus groups. And Dominic Cummings, of course, was the sort of the organizer of the focus groups. And, like last week, I was saying, no, Dominic, it's great because he is in touch.
Yeah.
Well, the other side of that argument, right, that Dominic Cummings is in charge of the output from Downing Street.
Yeah.
He's not in charge of cabinet. Boris Johnson is, but he is in charge of output. And actually, he's also in charge of input. If he is the person orchestrating the focus groups, as we know, you can ask a question in a certain way to get a certain answer. And focus groups are not cynical old people like you and me. They tend to be somebody nice that they pick off the street. These were NHS focus groups. And this is according to Paul. And he has looked into the document. So I am only quoting him. And so he said that they were almost, these are my words, they were titrating people's responses to the social distancing measures. They were titrating those against the messages that were coming out. So was 250,000 scary enough or too scary? So, let's move it down a notch and then let's move it right up. Because when we want a full lockdown, the number has to be really big, because that is the gun to the head. If you don't stay home, you'll die or you'll murder somebody.
Yeah.
Okay. But if it's 90,000, most people will think, oh, it's not that many. 1,600 people die a day anyway. So, 90, it is a pandemic. It's a maybe number anyway. And it is Professor Ferguson. He does tend to exaggerate. People would have been left with that ability to make up their own minds. But when you give them 500,000, that is a gun to your head as a normal citizen. So the government has breached the contract between us, and that's a contract of trust, because we have to trust they're acting in our best interests. We have to trust that they're informing us honestly.
Yeah.
They're
not. I mean, it's very disturbing, because, as you say, at the heart of this, there needs to be that confidence that the government is doing what it's doing in our best interests, not the government's best interests. There's a clear difference between those two things. And obviously, ultimately, politics prevails. And it looks then, Rebecca, that what happened in March was it was politics, not science, that prevailed. And yet, since then, we've been told it's all about the science, it's all about the science. But in actual fact, that was politics.
Well, I always thought it was the media. The media was determined to get the word lockdown. And, bearing in mind that I was in France when France went into lockdown, and I was slightly concerned they were going to lock down. So we just packed everything up and zoomed home. Yeah. And in fact, Macron announced their lockdown as we were traveling up, and we were sort of near Paris by the time he announced it. So I was really relieved. We slept in a field in Normandy just so we could be on the shuttle first thing. I was genuinely concerned they'd shut the borders. So that was on the 17th of March. Now, that was a full-on lockdown. I mean, the police were trawling along the streets, forcing people inside. And, they saw our car with a British number plate, so they weren't too stressed about us. But I actually had to intervene at one point for no good reason. But they were harassing a homeless guy who's sitting outside the French equivalent of, the Five and Dime or whatever store. And he's there drinking his cider. And the police are harassing him off the street. And I went up to him and said, well, he hasn't got a home. Where are you forcing him
to go to? Yeah.
Why are you harassing him? Which didn't go down well with the police. It went down very well with the homeless guy. This woman with speaking like hello, defending his rights.
I will say this only once. I
will say this only once. He has no home to go to. So in my schoolgirl French, I was defending this guy for free. But so they were really proper lockdown in Italy and Spain. We never had that lockdown. And my point here is what I was trying to say was it was the media that wanted the word lockdown, because we have never actually been subjected to the same restrictions as Southern Europe, to be sure.
Absolutely.
For which we should be grateful.
Well, do you think the media were looking at Italy, they were looking at Spain, they were looking at France in particular, I guess, as well, and they were saying we've got to be the same because we're all good little Europeans. We've got to be the same. Do you think was it just as crude as the media wanted us to be doing what our continental neighbours were doing? Because what else would they want it?
Well, again, it's run by teenagers, people who don't have scientific backgrounds. They're all humanities graduates. That's not a bad thing, by the way. But when you're dealing with a scientific issue, it is really better to speak to people who do know the science. But the editorial is what dictates the media, and it is an emperor's new clothes sort of parable, really, that nobody dares call it out unless you're Sweden, and in fact now Norway has in fact called it out. So yes, they wanted the headline, and I was beginning to feel during the daily briefings that all the media were doing was they were asking questions that were going to form tomorrow's headlines, but they could only ask two questions, which was PPE and testing, because they don't understand viruses, which is fine. They can't be expected to know everything, but at least go to the science editor and say, what should I ask today? The media's behaved shockingly badly, but so has social media. They have been appalling, shutting people down. Peter Hitchens got shadow blocked on his app. He did a video cast. It's called Trigonometry, and they're brilliant. Really quite probing, bit like you, sort of investigative chat sort of environment.
Yeah,
and he got shadow banned by YouTube and Twitter.
Oh yeah, I agree. I mean, the social media are deplorable. All of them, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube. In terms of if people want to talk about beyond the narrative, Rebecca, you're kind of a heretic. You're spreading fake news. In actual fact, it seems to me that what we've had for the last several months is fake news perpetrated by the legacy media, the mainstream media, and then flowing down into the social media.
The WHO has been a purveyor of fake as well.
Exactly, which is why I'm so glad President Trump has actually defunded them as step one. But you're right. I mean, the WHO was, in many regards, I mean, it very much China's poodle in all of this back in January, the infamous 14th of January tweet where they insisted there was no real likelihood of human-to-human transmission. I mean, God, in the annals of history, that's going to go down as a biggie. And yet, actually, in fairness, Rebecca, I don't read that too much in the, our media don't really talk about the WHO very much, do they?
No, but the utter hypocrisy, and if anybody on YouTube is watching this right now, any moderators, can I just say, you need to ban the WHO from social media because they criticize the WHO. So because the social media platforms, and I can come on to this because I've done a bit of research on it, they've been put under pressure to sort of enforce the current groupthink on lockdowns. So they don't want people undermining the lockdown message. Yeah, I get some of that argument, right? But that included not criticizing the WHO. So, for example, when the WHO says back in February, March, you must restrict freedoms, you must look at places like China and Taiwan for how they manage the pandemic, so on and so forth, they criticize Sweden for their lack of lockdown. 8 weeks later, they praised Sweden for the low death rate, a low death rate, given the density of population in their urban areas. So basically, the WHO has breached the YouTube guidelines on criticizing the WHO.
Yeah, well, I mean, that would be a blessing to have the WHO removed from every platform, actually, because it's done nothing for our global health and our global well-being. It's done quite a lot, though, to advance the interests of China, for example, who have been, to put it mildly, extraordinarily unhelpful in this one, and maybe worse than that, But yeah, so I think the British media, Rebecca, then can be seen to have behaved pretty much deplorably all the way through. And you mentioned, the daily press conference, showtime for politicians. I noticed today that Boris has announced that that's ending. The daily, it's going to end because apparently the viewing figures have fallen so low because nobody cares anymore. Nobody's interested.
Their viewing figures are about the same as Newsnight, which is quite low. Yeah.
Yes. No sane person watches that. But so
like these platforms, people watch YouTube and Facebook now. They watch this sort of thing to get chat and commentary and be able to contribute to it as well.
Yeah, I mean, there's a group that I moderate on Facebook called Lockdown Skeptics. It was set up by another lady who was very cynical about the lockdown, and in my opinion, rightly so. And, it's amazing. I see so many comments from intelligent people of all backgrounds and all persuasions. But, so many of the things that they say, and they're just talking like you and me, it could be seen to be in breach of, Facebook regulations in terms of service and whatnot. So it's been very difficult to have proper debate. Hopefully, so far nothing I've said has been attacked or taken down, and I hope not, because all we're trying to do really, Rebecca, is to bring a little light into the darkness of this.
I mean, I am merely repeating what I've read in the Sage Minutes today, and saying, well, if they're saying science, it's clearly not science, because the last meeting of Sage before the lockdown didn't mention lockdown. So it can't have been Sage. It must have been Cobra that decided it. That in itself, though, will be seen to undermine lockdown. Now, I did a tweet on the Center for Countering Digital Hate 6 weeks ago, and I've been blocked by all of them now, because who are they? Who are they to put pressure on the social media platforms to block people? How do they get that influence? They're an NGO. They're not elected by us. I mean, who moderates them? So that's what we can't listen to.
Yeah, no, I remember your tweets in that, and I mean that I think we put out on Alt News Media an article investigating the background to that organization, and it's quite illuminating. But as you say, incredibly disproportionate influence relative to their status, because essentially they're nobody, but they can shut down what you might say and what I might say and what lots of people here might say as well, because again, we are diverging from narrative, and that seems to be the ultimate sin.
Which, this is 2020 Britain, for heaven's sake. I mean, there's nothing outrageous about what we're saying. There's nothing outrageous by what Peter Hitchens is saying, or Toby Young, or people like that. There's nothing outrageous about these guys. I mean, there's nothing outrageous about David Icke, because he wasn't telling people to go out and burn down 5G masts. All he says is the place is run by lizards. And as a metaphor, I'm kind of in agreement with him. But, is Icke dangerous? No. Is Peter Hitchens is the first to admit that he won't last very long if he's got this wrong. He's the little boy in the Emperor's New Clothes in the story. He's the only one from the start who's been on a big platform to say, hang on a minute here. And he didn't know the stuff that I've given you today. This is hot off the press. This this disclosure from Sage is very recent, last couple of days. So
yeah. And actually, what the Sage disclosure really does, it kind of validates a lot of what Peter has said. To be fair, from day one, he's been very good, and he's asked all the right questions, probably almost uniquely amongst the mainstream media, because the rest of them don't ask questions at all. They're pursuing narratives. Peter's been excellent throughout this, but again, he's kind of a lone voice in that sort of forum of the legacy media. There's been so many people, and I'll just name a couple of them that have disappointed me, not least Julia Hartley-Brewer, who was calling for the head of Dominic Cummings a week ago. Disappointed in Julia in that one. Not that I'm sure she's in the least bothered what I think, but so many of them have failed, and maybe to have expectation is foolish, Rebecca, of them in the first place, because that would suggest that they are intrepid seekers of truth rather than snake oil salesmen.
Yeah, they're intrepid seekers of their own following. That's what everything is clickbait. It really is. I was discussing this with somebody the other day about, the times I've been on RT, and I said that they're really only interested in putting me on when they can get some clickbait out of it. And despite what people think, I don't get paid for going on there. I'm only on there to discuss actually Brexit in the good old days. And now, because of my nursing background, of course, they had the barrister who's a nurse as well. So it was like the perfect thing after Brexit. But they only put me on when there's an ability to clickbait what happens. And the last interview I did, the last debate, as they called it, they had to mute the woman on the other side because she was just a ranting lunatic.
Was that Dr. Shola?
Yeah, it was brilliant. I mean, if anybody wants to look at it, it's on my YouTube channel. But honestly, the producer obviously on the mute button, because she was just, it was brilliant television for somebody. I felt cringingly embarrassed about it, but it was really bad. But they put the whole thing up. They got the whole thing up on Twitter, and it got loads of views. Who cut my hair? Did somebody just ask that?
Somebody asked about your hair.
No, this is just the front bit. It's all tied up at the back. So otherwise my partner said I look like a cocker spaniel, so I had to put it up. So I haven't cut my hair. I haven't broken lockdown, don't worry.
Yeah. But the thing is that the whole performance offer media, in terms of, as you say, advancing their narrative, seeking clickbait, has actually, in the last 3 or 4 days, I've taken a conscious decision on all social media platforms that I won't actually link to them below anything I say. I'll maybe copy paste it. I might do that, but I'm not going to give them the benefits of my traffic and other people's as well, because they're not worth it. Because nothing if they were saying stuff like this, Rebecca, there'd be loads of reason to tweet it and send it out and share it. But it's so dreary and utterly predictable. Even tonight, as we talk tonight, I can see the BBC, and actually, because they all follow each other, don't they? It's all about COVID and the BME, the BAME, the Black and Ethnic Community, disproportionately affected, blah, 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 implying that a virus is racist, for God's sake.
It's actually Bangladeshis that it affects more than anybody. And I can't wait to have a pop at somebody over this. I mean, it was obvious to all of them that all of the pictures of dead NHS staff were male, Asian subcontinent doctors. I mean, that was pretty obvious. And I did a piece on it, and I did look at the research and looked at sort of all of the comorbidities in the BAME. I find when I say BAME, I know people who are in those groups don't like to be lumped in together. It's like people of color. It's like, please don't lump me into one category. So I prefer to call it what it is. So people from the Afro-Caribbean or the Negroid communities do have a resistance to ACE inhibitors. We know the spike protein on coronavirus attacks the ACE on your cell wall. So they were asking the question, because they're so resistant to ACE inhibitors, they have higher doses of them. So that those are the drugs that bring down your blood pressure. So is it because they're on higher doses in that age group?
Yeah.
And they may be because they tend to be overweight as well. Is that why there's a higher death rate in the Black Negro communities? In fact, there isn't that much of a higher death rate in those.
No, it's not.
It's actually in the Bangladeshi community. So it's not even in the Hindu Indian or the Muslim Pakistan communities. It's the Bangladeshi. So the East Pakistan, as it used to be called in the days
that's right.
Britain being in India, it was the other side of India. So why Bangladeshis? Do they have a racial tendency to something that predisposes them to the respiratory problems and the clotting issues with coronavirus? Who knows? But what we do know is that men are disproportionately affected.
Yeah, it's sexist.
Yeah,
that's right. Yeah. I mean, not only is it racist, it's sexist. But no, on the serious note, you're right insofar as, but like the media have said today, that they're flogging this dead horse to attack the government on a race platform, and yet the report on which they base it, Rebecca, specifically excludes comorbidities. So, to me, it's a meaningless report. So so there's a somewhat disproportionate effect within part of that community, but without any other data, so what?
But you might say, and I'm sure a lot of your followers and people who go on Facebook, a lot of them might say, well, that community hasn't observed social distancing. They've not been as careful as other communities, shall we say, at observing the rules. Because, if you look at the disproportionate pictures on the, on the media of all the people who've died, and then you also look on the other media, the Facebook, and see all the people going to mosques and funerals and street protests and lobbing Molotov cocktails around, then they're not really socially distancing while they're doing that either. So if they're doing that under the glare of somebody's iPhone camera, what are they doing in their private lives? There are just too many contributing factors. And you shouldn't point the finger at anybody, because it's a damn virus. It's a pandemic. They kill people. They really kill people.
Yeah. Well, and you say that, but that's another really good point you've just made. The fact that if there is this disproportionate effect in that particular that community or communities, and also we see the people assembled in Trafalgar Square and elsewhere on the Black Lives Matter and all of that business, and there seems to be a relatively high ethnic mix to that. I don't see the media making a connection there. Like, these people are exposing themselves to the very thing that we are saying, on the other hand, is more likely to kill them. So, what's the logic? There's no consistency whatsoever, is there?
It's intellectual dishonesty. There's a complete dissonance. And it actually, in a way, it's no different to the long lens of 100 people that look as though they're a foot apart because they're walking in the Peak District. It's no different to that. But it's the thing about dealing with race is that the editorial is always, you cannot make a single word of complaint about it for fear of being called racist. And actually, I'm looking across the Atlantic now at Donald Trump saying to the sheriffs and the local people, you're jerks if you do not show dominance over what's happening. because nobody is supporting what that police officer did. Well, the 3 police officers, effectively,
four
who downed George Floyd.
Floyd,
It was horrendous, and the officer who's been charged has got 17 misdemeanors recorded against him. I mean, the guy should never have been in a uniform carrying a gun. This is a problem in America, but they cannot ask those questions because they've got looting and Molotov cocktails and a very strange group of anti-fascists behaving like ultra-fascists. So
which is exactly what they are. And Antifa are fascist. I mean, they just play the word games to pretend that they're not. But I mean, I'm glad you brought this. You've nicely segued the conversation there, Rebecca. Top marks into what's happening across the Atlantic, because it is, but there's several things worry me about it. Although, just to maybe finish for 1 second on the UK. We've seen the importance of social distancing, 2 meters and all of that, which I don't agree with, but other people do. However, I didn't see any social distancing by the mobs going along Whitehall and Trafalgar Square, protesting against the killing of George Floyd. So where is the credibility of a government, Rebecca, that allows that on the one hand, but tells us that we've still got to be 2 meters apart from fellow human beings in most cases? I mean, where is the consistency?
Well, I want to know where the police officer was who poured the water on the barbecue on the beach in Brighton. I want to know where that police officer was when those people were in Trafalgar Square, because I've seen a hell of a lot of images of police doing downright crazy stuff to people sitting on park benches and, as I say, behaving as those, well, somebody has given them total power, but behaving like, complete nutters in their interpretation of these rules. Where were those police? Where were they? Are they too busy going to the easy places?
I think so.
Persecuting people like me for being on my bike. Why weren't the police doing something? Why?
Well, I mean,
dress up in stupid rainbows during the Notting Hill Carnival when it has the highest number of knife deaths at any time in London is during the Notting Hill Carnival. Where are they? They're wearing rainbows on their heads. It just sickens me. It really, as a taxpayer, I'm really racked off by all of this.
I think a lot of us, with a small c, conservative people, we always support the rule of law and we support the police. But I have to say, it gets harder and harder when you see things like them dressed up as as prancing rainbows and the rest of it. At the same, that would be okay if there was no crime. But then we wouldn't need them, I suppose. But there's no shortage of crime, not least in the Notting Hill Stabathon, which happens each year. So I think there's an issue there. But jumping across to the States, I mean, we see American cities aflame. I've seen stuff. I'm sure you've seen some of it as well, Rebecca, on social media. Some of the videos, it's almost unbelievable what I see.
Terrifying, absolutely terrifying. I mean, I've seen a couple of pictures now of white guys defending their businesses and just getting put to the ground and then kicked in the face. I honestly, and I look at these guys lying on the ground and I think, please wake up, please, don't die. And you see their limbs are broken and just the brutality that is being committed against people protecting their businesses is shot. It's as bad as what happened to Floyd. It's as bad. It's brutality, but it's not justified at all.
No, there's no justification, and yet here in the UK, there's plenty of sympathy. I mean, today we've had the musicians union having a Black Tuesday. You know, there's to be no live music or whatever in the UK today, as a mark of respect for George Floyd. I'm very sorry Mr. Floyd lost his life in the way in particular that he did. Although I'm also, Rebecca, aware of the autopsy, the official autopsy report. So it's like a lot of things. What we need to do is stand back, let the law take its course, let it, you know, if the police officer stroke officers have done wrong, let them be brought to justice, and that's fine by me. No issues in that. But none of that justifies, you know, beating people to within an inch of their life, burning their livelihoods down, the intimidation, the looting, and then we get some strange things. Like I seen a tweet of a Louis Vuitton store somewhere being looted, and then I discovered that one of the fashion designers from Louis Vuitton was contributing to the bail fund for the people who had done the looting. And I thought to myself, we need to stop this world. I need to get off. Well, how can this insanity prevail? And then President Trump is in a very difficult position because obviously he has to be careful how he handles this. But you just can't stand by, can you, and let America burn?
But Obama had police brutality cases. I mean, yeah. I can remember Rodney King that sparked the LA riots. It's not a Trump issue. This is police brutality. It's the way the police behave, the authority with which they're given, the fact that everybody thinks that the only way to deal with gun crime is to have a bigger gun. It's a culture that America and its obsession with the Second Amendment to the Constitution and this bizarre interpretation of their right to bear Kalashnikovs, it's this obsession, and they're recruiting the wrong people. They are seriously have a problem with the police. I mean, in Obama's reign, there was that young 14-year-old black boy in Florida.
Yes. Yeah, I know who you're chatting about. Yeah. There were those issues then, but somehow it's different when it's President Trump all the same. You know, the media's treatment, CNN, ABC, all the usual culprits across there. I mean, and actually, Rebecca, one of my the things that most egregiously offends me is to describe people who loot and arson and burn and attempt to kill. These aren't protesters. They're thugs.
They're violent thugs. They're awful. They're awful people. And anybody who joins those protests are awful people. And they are accessories in every single offense. And why? I mean, a fool and his money are soon parted. If people think that the bail funds are going to go anywhere, well, good luck to you. You're actually a bit stupid if you think contributing to that is of any value at all. I really think that, you know, America, the media in America has a major issue, but it's like talking about Antifa as though, you know, the labeling of being anti-fascist means that you're not a terrorist and you're not a violent thug, and a chaos merchant. I object to that label, just like I object to the CCD hate label, because there's nothing about them or hope not hate. They are hate and hate.
Well, actually, I object to the Black Lives Matter handle, because I think all life matters. It doesn't matter what skin color. Every one of us, regardless of our ethnicity, should be able to get about our lives, you know, without fear or menace or any of the rest of it. I think once you sort of identify one race group as being more disadvantaged than the others, I think you're in the wrong platform. But let me ask you this: Trump has actually I think he's introducing legislation to define Antifa in the States as domestic terrorists. What do you think would happen in the UK if we had similar riots?
we would be supine and do nothing about it. We'd be more worried about what Laura Kuenssberg had to say about it. The day after the election last December, Antifa were outside Downing Street screaming, "Not our PM," and I thought, sorry, what do you mean not RPM? I think it is, and they soon turn violent. This is all the same group of people that go on these ridiculous Extinction Rebellion things and, are adherents to Greta Thunberg. It's the same. It's the same mindset, and I'm sure it's not that many people really in Antifa, because it just can't be that many people. And I'm sure a lot of them, like a lot of the racial commentators that we are blessed with on our media channels, they live in actually quite privileged neighborhoods and are quite stuck it all up. A few come to mind, but I won't mention them by name. Ash Sarkar might be one of them. I always refer, she's Navarra Media. I always refer
I know her. I know her, yeah.
Media, as I call it. But yeah, so I find that the commentators have very little credibility for me, and they enjoy the chaos. It's what they want.
They do, and the same as most of us enjoy sort of a sense of what's the word? Well-being and a sense of order. They do. They love the chaos. They love, in some instances, just destroying sometimes their own communities, like we've seen in the States. I'm very proud of those Black Americans that I've seen standing up to the mob. Those are the real heroes. Those are the Black lives that really matter, in my opinion, because they're showing real courage, and they need every support we can possibly give them. But I have to say, Rebecca, we've got the hour's gone by as ever very, very quickly. And, listen, I wanted to thank you very much for being with us again tonight, and thanks very much for all that you've told us about the murky origins of lockdown. So I hope everyone pays attention to what was said. Thanks everybody for being on the stream tonight across the different platforms. And I hope to have Rebecca. I hope you'll come back again, Rebecca. You're very welcome here. And I will see you guys another evening. Bye for now.
Bye.